Blessings and welcome back, everyone, to our 22nd episode in our journey through the zodiacal faces and Scorpio I. Happy birthday, Scorpios! I am Elsa, and I'm thankfully and gratefully joined again today by KD Dayton and David Fisher. And you can find KD Dayton at kddayton.com and David Fisher at In the First Place Astrology in most places. So the dates for this start at around 22nd and 23rd of October up until the 31st and maybe the 1st of November, depending on where you are. And this is around Halloween and Samhain and Day of the Dead and kind of those energies. And I just wanted to note that off the top because we are dealing with some of those topics in this Decan, and so it's apropos that they all sort of, merge together. Before I get into the cards and into the authors, I just wanted to shout out to one of our subscribers who asked me, what are the Decans? It's a new subscriber, they're a friend, and they have come to me for many readings, and they're totally into astrology. But I was like, yeah, this is, a lot of people, I think it's a niche kind of group that might follow us anyways. But for the people that come here and that are just stumbling upon it and might not know, we are going to, and we've addressed this like in Aries, and when we first started this series, we addressed it, but I just wanted to reiterate it a little bit today, and then also let you know that we will be doing a follow-up video sometime soon that just explains what are the Decans and how to use them. So in, put simply, or sort of in, a compact way of understanding it, you have a zodiacal sign like Scorpio, and then that sign is broken up into three equal parts of 10 degrees each, and you have a main ruler of the sign. So you have Mars rules Scorpio, and then each little third of the sign has a co-ruler that helps Mars or is in service to Mars or sort of alchemizes Mars. So in this case, we have this time a double ruled Mars. So here in Scorpio 1, we've got Mars because it rules all of Scorpio. And then this Decan specifically is a martial or Mars ruled Decan. So it doesn't share its significations. It doesn't share with it doesn't have to appease any other of the gods. It doesn't have to share its martial qualities. So it gives it a lot of power when you see a part of the sign that is the main lord and the co-lord. So that being said, do you all want to talk just a little bit about Mars straight out of the gate? We could kind of talk just, because it's such a martial Decan, and because we're going to be talking about Mars as the Scorpio ruler and in its feminine water sign. So we've talked about Mars quite a bit as a co-ruler and definitely through the Aries series. So if you want to get a deeper understanding of how Mars acts in a masculine sign or in general, you can go back and watch the Aries Decan videos. But now we've got it here in Scorpio, which is its feminine iteration. And just to remind us, so we've got a lot of Mars here. If you guys want to, kind of color it with its feminine qualities, I know we didn't really talk about this much to start, but it just reminded me, maybe let's talk a little bit about Mars straight out of the gate. So on one polarity for me, like the things that I think of, and I'm not going to list everything according to Valens. I'm just kind of getting the ball rolling, and I want to hear from you guys as well. I'll just say a few things. On one polarity of Mars, it's courage and bravery and sort of standing in the face of justice. It's willing to be a warrior. It's willing to go out there and make itself uncomfortable or fight for something. And it might, on another polarity, have things like violence or mistrust, or maybe like lying or cheating, or kind of like a desire quality, right? And we're going to get deeply into the desire quality of Mars because it's sort of hot and fast, which we talk about in Aries, but it can be kind of brooding here in its water quality. It can kind of be like boiling under the surface, and it can have to do with like grasping and getting out for what's mine, and like lust and jealousy. And one part of Mars is like adultery and I guess things for sex for pleasure, let's just say, things like that, right? And we've also got Scorpio ruling that part of the body, the genitals and things like that. So it can definitely have to do with like bloodlust or like lust for things, whether it be like power or desire, things like this. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about some general Mars significations. And again, this is a Mars ruled sign. We'll be going over it again and again. And this is a Mars ruled Decan. And what we have, the card for Mars is the blasted tower. So we're going to be talking about the tower card throughout this martial Decan, which we've talked about in many others. So KD, how about you, like just off the top, off the cuff, when you're thinking about Mars, or maybe even Mars in its feminine water sign, what does it conjure up for you? What should people be thinking about?
Well, the keyword that I usually like to focus on with Mars is severing, because Mars really cuts things. There are kind of actions that each planet seem to operate on, and Mars is cutting off. And so that's a really big part of and factors into this sort of tree of different meanings of Mars for me. So that's how we get violence, fighting, and competition. It's because you're cutting things apart and dividing things. But other than that, I really think of Mars sometimes in relation to sport. Mercury also can be sport with its certain kind of gestureliness, but Mars is much more competitive and passionate and very into the competitive spirit. So
right, Mercury is like for the game of it, for the trickery,
yeah,
for let's see who wins, and Mars is like, I'm gonna beat you. And it's like Mars is the athlete, right? Like Mars is the fighter. Mars is like working its body through blood, sweat, and tears in order to win, something like this, right? And we can see that through some general significations of Mars finding joy in the 6th house, which is like accident and injury, and also athletes and that type of thing. How about you, David? What about Mars? We could just set people up. What should they know about something being extremely Martian or in its water feminine domicile here?
So when we're talking about water, again, we're talking about the body, right? The connection to the senses. And we are talking about memory. We are talking about fixed water. So it could be about things that are very fixed from your past experience, let's say, like that. Why am I referring to it in that way when I'm talking about Scorpio? Because by being the fall of the moon, it's talking about those things that kind of scar or experience through circumstance in a bad way. So it's like our triggers, the things that we have defenses up against through circumstance that reinforce narratives that are less than ideal for us, the things that threaten our idea of belonging, our idea of security through circumstance. All of those things fall in Scorpio. And here in this decan, we have Mars being so strong exactly because you have the kind of experience and expression of that nature, being disappointed, being deeply hurt, being traumatized, having a sense of dissociating from reality, from the reality that you had idealized and having to let it go. You know, all of this is treated in this decan. So Mars, again, defense mechanism, sense of self-protection.
Absolutely, yeah, because it can be a protector, right? It can go out there and fight for the family.
And it's self-protection through means of violence, as you guys were saying. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it can just be like, it doesn't necessarily have to be violent. Let's say it just can stand in the face of its fear, right? So it can just say like, I'm not going to take this emotional abuse anymore. Or, you know, and when David says the body, I think the sensation. So a lot of times we'll associate the emotions with the water signs. And so you're getting like these sensatory things. That's why you're thinking about like what the body wants and the desires and the hungers. It's something, you know, and we're going to really belabor this as we get into, you know, the significations that Austin and Susan bring forward. But I think it's really cool what David brings up with the fixity, because we see cardinality in Aries. We see this masculine, like, get things started, let's move, let's move. And here it's things that you don't want to let go of. So the other cards that we have, I think it's a good segue, the fixity of like things we're used to, or traumas that we sort of experience in our emotional body as a child, coming up as an adult and not really knowing how to let go or how to deal, or kind of being fixed in a certain cycle. We have death. We have the death card. And this is called in the Hermetic deck, the Child of the Great Transformers. And this is the Scorpio card. So we're going to be talking about this card through all of Scorpio, and we're going to go deep into the significations of this card. So we're going to give general overviews today and then kind of bring it up as we go through Scorpio. But it's a transformation. It's like, we don't want to die. We don't necessarily want the people that we love to die, but we have to reconcile with it anyways and make friends with it on some level anyways. It's going to come either way. How do we want it to come, and things like that. So it's like looking at our fear of the unknown, the things we don't want to let go of, the fear of death. And it can also just be like severing things, severing toxic things. So Scorpio has to do with toxins and poisons, and like how hard it can be to like break those emotional cycles and things like that, and how much we don't want to let things go. We don't want to cut things off. We don't want to have maybe, I mean, some people are better at dealing with it than others, but we don't want to have that explosive moment that leads to the end of a friendship or the end of a relationship or something like that, because we don't want to experience sorrow. And that is our other card here, the Five of Cups, which we're going to get into a little bit more. But here it is in the Hermetic deck, the Lord of Loss in Pleasure. So losing something to pleasure or in pleasure, because we're pleasure seeking. So the loss of, you know, we want too much gambling, we want too much sex, we want too much of this or that. Our desires sort of bring us into a place of loss. And that is a little bit of what we're talking about here with the Five of Cups. So anything you guys want to say? I'm going to bring it to Austin, and then we'll bring it to Susan and kind of go deeper into the tarot as well. But do you guys have any thoughts before I dive in to Austin's work?
I really like the classification of the Five of Cups as the feeling of being bereft, because I think that implies a loss of a very specific nature. It's not just like your casual, I don't know, I lost $1 or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's really deeply felt, very sincere loss. And so I just wanted to highlight that in relation to the Minor Arcana card for this Decan.
Yeah, and you know, I just want to take the opportunity, I guess, before we start. When we're talking about Mars, we're talking about fear and pain. And you know, I just want to send out my compassion and condolences to anyone that is dealing with deep loss or has dealt with deep loss, because we're not sort of talking about these as like esoteric ideas. We're talking, especially in this second, about something that's very tangible. So those of you who have had like, you know, some kind of health crises or diagnoses or lost a dear person in your life, we all know what that grief feels like. And so I just want to extend my warmth and comfort to those who are dealing with that, you know, now, or have had to deal with that in the past. And it can be slightly triggering. So I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a compassion and maybe a little bit of a disclaimer as we jump into the second. So Austin Coppock calls this a jawbone. And he says he does this over just a skull, which a lot of times we'll associate the skeleton or the skull here in Scorpio. But really bones and those types of things are a very Saturnine thing. So a jawbone showing the sort of loss and death, but that sort of hunger and that mastication. So like eating or like chewing food, it has an inherent sort of like violence to it, or an inherent hunger, kind of mashing up feeling, that I think is a little bit more signified by the jawbone versus just like the skull or something like this. T. Susan Chang calls it storm or the storm of tears. And the Five of Cups, the Lord of Loss and Pleasure, or in the Rider-Waite, it's called the Lord of Disappointment. So I suppose it wouldn't have to be the grieving of the loss of a loved one or the mortality of your life flashing before you, but it can just be like, man, I really wanted that relationship to work, and you have to reckon with the fact that it won't, or something like this, and it's super disappointing, and there's no way around that. Austin talks about this as, yeah, hunger, and there's no way of sort of satiating hunger forever, like with that fixed quality. You don't just feast once and stay full. It's like you have to have a certain type of relationship to your own desire and to your own hunger. You have to sort of like regulate when it comes to Mars. You have to be aiming towards like a higher ideal of facing your fears or having courage or something like that, versus like bloodlust and violence. You have to really kind of curtail that, because this could have to do with like binge eating, or on the contrary, maybe trying to have a relationship with that hunger where you're abstaining completely or something like this. It's like you can just feast, but it's only however many hours, 12, 24, 60, however long it is for your body before that hunger will strike again. And there's no way of sort of feeding our hunger forever. So I think this kind of talks about like that ever moving goalpost of our desires and fears. And it can be a very visceral thing when you think about being hungry. It's like something that feels out of control for your body. So it, like when David was talking about, it's not just emotions, it can be like a visceral thing, like you walk around the corner and you didn't know someone was standing there, or you have to stomp on your brakes in the car and you almost got in an accident or something like this, and you get this just sheer like body feeling, right? It's definitely all of that. So Austin talks about it as it exposes hard truth, that kind of hard truth that we have to reckon with. And we're confronting this, by confronting this cycle, we're less bound to it, and we're less blind, as if we just kind of like ignore those fears or ignore that death is looming. And he talks about the revealed dharma of the hungry ghost. So that kind of insatiable desire, and then, you know, the Tao of desire.
It's funny, that insatiable desire piece also somehow reminds me of the North Node. And Scorpio is the fall of the moon. And the moon is something we often relate to nourishment. So when you have that sort of insatiable hunger, it's as though you can't ever reach your fill. And there are a lot of different interpretations of the nodes of the moon and what they might mean. But one is that the North Node is something that you're constantly hungering after but can never actually attain. So I find that something relevant, at least the psychological profile of that being relevant to Mars as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we just had the eclipses here in this Mars Scorpio. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
No, I just wanted to mention that with the hunger piece, Mars in Aries, as we were talking about in the first video of the series, that Decan was all about I can, I want to, I will do it.
I will.
Notice that, yes, notice that there is no should I do it? You know, there is no stop and question mark there. With Mars, there is no limit. There is no line. It all kind of gets blurry. Mars is not exact when it comes to rules. It is exact when it comes to its action. It is like, I will it, I will do it. It doesn't matter how many rules I break. It doesn't matter how many lines I cross. But when it comes to Scorpio, it's feminine domicile. It brings out the cunning. in Mars in a way, because it's when circumstance denies Mars the physical ability of doing its will, of performing its will. And so what are the tools, what are the mechanisms that Mars will use then to assert its will? It will be through more subtle means. It will not be through direct action. It will be more indirect kind of action. It'll be more towards the feeling realm, the emotional realm, the psychological realm.
Yeah, and it's, you know, a traditional signification. It can be kind of like more plotting, because it's happening, like it's brooding, right? It's on the inside, it's emotional, it's bodily, it's all of these things. So, and when we're talking about hunger, that's what we're talking about, like literal physical hunger and things like that. So I like that interpretation. And then, you know,
and they can signify, I just want to make a disclaimer. They can signify some of the same things that Aries would signify, like guns, like warriors, and all of the things that Mars itself signifies. I'm not saying that it's all about feelings, but I'm saying that I like to think of Scorpio as opposed to Aries in that way of when you're, you know, the sun is exalted, when you're allowed to perform your will, and versus you're not by circumstance, like you don't have enough to perform your will, or you're afraid of
and it's a rule breaker. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's a rule breaker. That's what I was trying to think of with the traditional Mars signification, is it does do things on purpose to be taboo. And I think that's especially here, where in its masculine sign, it's very focused on like material conquest or something. Here it would be like maybe emotional conquest, or things that, you know, it's the Lord of loss through, you know, it's disappointed through its loss of like desires and things like that, right? So like what happens when we don't get what we want? And I just want to make this clear, and I'm sure we'll get to it when we get to Capricorn, which we're all super excited for. But the ancients thought of the feminine domiciles of the malefics is extraordinarily shitty or malefic, right? So it's like, not only is it a malefic, but put it in a masculine sign, it can do stuff, like we like it, but put it in a feminine sign and oh no, like you're, you know, because like your Capricorn gets Capricorn, Saturn's feminine domicile gets a real bad rap, especially Scorpio in the ancients gets a real bad rap. One thing I did want to just draw your attention to, and I'm going to put it in the links below, is just recently, I don't know, in the last day or so, one of our friends, Matt from the Astrologer's Encyclopedia, just did an entire treatment of Mars, and they are doing an entire treatment of all of the planets over on their channel. So if y'all want to go over there and check it out, I was listening to it in preparation for this video, and you will see, and you can see some of the significations. I would say if you're trying to learn about Mars, or even trying to understand the decans or the masculine and feminine domicile, when you're hearing the significations of Mars come out, let's just say, go ahead and start to divide them in your mind, because Mars is division, right? It's like you stop here, you have to cut something off, you have to die, someone has to die, you're cut away from something you don't want, you're disappointed. So go ahead and listen when you're thinking about the Mars significations. If you go over to Matt's channel and check out what they did, it's an amazing treatment on Mars. But start to divide, say, oh, that sounds like a more Scorpionic version of Mars. Oh, or the feminine version of Mars. Oh, that sounds a little bit more like the masculine or the sort of Aries version of Mars. And just see how you can kind of bring those significations out in the long list of significations that they do.
One other way of thinking about this is, whereas one domicile of Mars is the exaltation of the diurnal luminary, meaning it's a place where consciousness is exalted. Why? Because you can fulfill that ideal with physical action, Mars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, Mars is still physical action.
Can you explicitly say, I'm sorry, can you explicitly say the sun is exalted in Aries, for those of you?
Oh, yes. And in Scorpio, you have the moon being in fall, which is the other luminary. So it's another extreme. One diurnal luminary exalted, the other nocturnal luminary fallen. And it's still bringing out the same archetype of action, rebellion, that in Aries, it would bring from the solar perspective. From the moon's perspective, it is inspired by fear. Remember, the moon card in tarot specifically signifies fear, signifies things that are buried deep in your subconscious, that are sprouting out to the surface now through fearsome circumstances that are unsettling to you.
Yeah, and deception. Mm-hmm.
And so Scorpio brings out those reactions from Mars through those lunar significations, through those particular shadowy sides of the moon, of the moon's experience.
And something you're making me think to bring up now would also be when we think about the moon, let's say in Cancer or exalted in Taurus, we think about this feminine nurturing, right? So if you think about it in Cancer, you think about like birth and the nurturing of the mother and mother's milk and all this. You think about in Taurus, and Taurus we all know is the foodie and the garden and the walled garden and all this kind of like opulence as far as just like sensations, like things that smell good, things that taste good, things that make you feel good, like all of that. Like that's where the moon's at. Here, the moon is sort of stripped of those things. So when we think about nourishment, where Austin calls this, right, like talks about hunger, but we have this constant hunger, but we're not, the moon is in fall, so it's not getting nourished, or it's not getting that sort of like juicy, watery, it's kind of like colder and darker, and it can be hungry, but it's not sort of maintaining that sensory quality that the moon looks for in being nourished by its food, being supported by its food, right? It's sort of stripped away of its nourishment, and all it can get is hunger. So again, that kind of like hungry ghost, or like KD said, the North Node, the kind of like constant hunger. So
I wanted to say one more thing about that though, which is so we consider Aries the masculine sign, the warrior archetype, and so as a result of Scorpio, the feminine sign of Mars being a nocturnal feminine sign, it's more of a protector. That's something that I often see when I'm talking to people who have Mars ruled moon signs in general, but especially in Scorpio. It's that feeling of willing to sacrifice and drive hard in order to protect the people that inspire that sort of emotional.
And it can also be the fall of protection, like not knowing what's dangerous, or getting into things where we're not really protecting ourselves. Like I don't want to get too 12th housey or something like this with this sort of self-undoing qualities, but just like not knowing when enough is enough, or kind of self-sacrificing the body in order to obtain certain types of pleasures, or to sort of skirt your fears or skirt your disappointments, or kind of lying to yourself about certain things because you have a hunger for it, or, that kind of thing where you're going, around yourself emotionally to sort of maybe avoid the tower moment or avoid the sorrow or something like this. So you can get a little bit of that in there too. So it's not just the lack of protection for the self, but it also could be walling off the self, like protecting the self so much because of different traumas or different emotional sort of like needs that were unmet, or disappointments we've had in the past, or things like this. So how we protect ourselves, how we protect our hungers and our desires, and those things are really complex. Having desires for things and where the line is on that can be tricky, I think, like how we protect ourselves and how we so anyways, all I'm saying is it could have to do with like different types of addiction, or different types of lust for sensations or emotions, like wanting to have something but not getting it, or something like that. So in the 36 heirs of the zodiac, the nymphi, or the nymphs that we know them as today, are daimones that were of the hills and the meadows and the forests and the rivers. And we know nymphs as these objects of desire, both for gods and mortals, right? They're just these beautiful kind of like sexual, fun, just like playing energy of the earth that kind of tantalize our sensation. And sometimes I could think of it almost as like a siren, right? Because the siren is like this mermaid in the water, and it has this sort of like alluring, tantalizing, hypnotic kind of effect And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the nymphs that were associated here. And we'll get into the nymphs a little bit more again when we come to the Capricornian archetype as well. So I just wanted to cover that because it was brought up in the airs. And yeah, so it's just hunger awakening and finding out what you can get and what you can't get and how much you can eat and how much you can take, and how much loss we find in pleasure. Like if we really pleasure something, we really put it on a pedestal, we really want it and we can't have it, or we're disappointed by something. And maybe our health, like his moon is the body, right? Or moon is the mother, or like this, the childhood mother scenario. So it's like maybe desiring after a certain emotional state or a certain person or a certain thing and just being disappointed because we can't have it, or feeling disappointed with our life at the end of it when death, you know, looms or something, or death coming too quick and we're us not wanting to give up our sensations and our bodies as moon being the body. So, all right, I think that covers the notes that I have on Austin. If we want to comment a little bit.
I wanted to move on to the Picatrix next, on the order of things. I know we generally do the Picatrix last, but I think that we're going to cover a lot of topics talking about tarot that are going to illustrate what the Picatrix is saying as well. So I'm just going to read it now and we can just go on to the tarot and
awesome. Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Together. So there rises in the first phase of Scorpio a man with a lance in his right hand, and in his left hand he holds the head of a man. This is the face of settlement, sadness, ill will, and hatred. This is its form. Cheerful, isn't it?
Cheerful, yeah. I mean, honestly, you guys, I have to say, like, you know, we pile up on certain signs, obviously, like I mentioned, but this is a pile up. Like, if you, these are, okay, we've got the 10 of swords and the 9 of swords. We've got some sword cards that are not good. We already went through that in Gemini, and we all know, like, okay, we've got some sword cards that we don't like to see, some backstabbing shit we don't like to see when you're laying on the ground with 10 swords in your back. But I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say when someone gets the Tower or the Death card in their reading, if they're not being nuanced about, it's about transformation and it's about like liberation. Okay, cool. Yeah. But also when these come up, they're always going to have a visceral
suffering experience attached.
Yeah, just them. Even for a reader, there's like, oh, okay, Death card today. All right, we're listening or whatever. And the same with the 5, like the pips in the Hermetic deck are a little bit less illustrative, but you know, as Katie will show when she puts up the 5 of Cups, we'll see different depictions of it, but it is like head down, cups spilled, tears coming, you know, a storm of tears, right? And we've got all of them to reckon with in this deck, and it's like, oh, you know, a traumatic moment and also a loss, and also we have to suffer that disappointment, and they're all here. So
I want to bring up that malefics are malefics, whatever moderns might say, and you have
no shade.
No, all shade, all shade, bitch.
All shade. So, okay, all shade here. Okay.
All right.
You have the malefics being these energies that are challenging to life and to the natural flow of life and to the comfortable flow of life. And so when you have a malefic emphasized in the zodiac in the way that Mars is emphasized in the beginning of Scorpio, you will have harsh experiences. Don't expect it to be the higher octave of Mars and it be like the higher expression of Mars and it'd be like, oh, I am a, I don't know, black belt in karate or something. And I have the, no, it's going to have a lot of suffering. Yeah, it's going to have a lot of suffering attached to it. It's going to have a lot of shit attached to it. It's going to have a lot of mental distress attached to it. Just understand it. Because Mars is a planet of problems, is a planet of maleficent deeds. Let's say like that.
Let me just do a little anecdote. We haven't gotten to this yet, but we have suffered going through this Decan a little bit ourselves. We were all like, ooh, Scorpio 1, and ooh, this kind of like badass like Decan and like whatever. we've had extreme technical difficulties during this.
Extreme technical difficulties.
This is the third time coming up.
Third time.
Third
go.
charm. So I just want to say, you know, to the gods and the lords of this Decan, we bow to you in humility and reverence, because this is no joke. We are here for it. We are humble to its disappointments for sure.
And what I was saying with Mars being so harsh is that, of course, in this part of the zodiac, as we are going to talk about in tarot, there are still ways of mitigating the things that you go through in these experiences. And this is the part that is because of consciousness. Whilst you're alive, you have a way of it for everything. There's a way for resolving everything just by being alive. So there's always a way out. But this Decan in particular represents some of the harshest circumstances in life, where you really have to choose to come up with something good from, you know, deep within you, to try and cope.
Yeah, we have to reconcile with death, okay? Like, all our shit came crumbling down. Someone broke up with us. We ended a marriage we didn't want to end. We were on the receiving side.
And so it is the closest that you get to the malefic experience hardcore, you know? When you get so much of these malefic energies tied together in one place.
And it's a storm of tears. And you know what? Sometimes, and hopefully I can remember to link this below. There's an absolutely beautiful author and teacher that's really changed my life. And when I first was introduced to this teacher, it was through this particular lecture, and it's online on YouTube for free, so I'm going to link it below. But it's called Grief and Praise by Martín Prechtel. And it talks about how we don't have a good relationship with grief in our societies, our puritanical societies. Like, we don't have a good relationship with death, and how if we can learn to grieve, it's a form of praise for the loss that you have. So if you only shed one tear, you know, it's because we're so rigid. It's like, did that person even, let's say we shed one tear at a funeral, did that person even live? Did their life even impact us if all we can do is screech out like one little tear? No. If someone you loves die, give them a storm of tears. Throw yourself on the ground and lament, right? So there's something here to be learned by, like, diving in to the depths of death in the tower. Like, really get in there, allow a storm of tears to come. Sometimes all we can do in grief is accept it and cry and try to, like, cope and figure out, now what? I have 2 months to live. Holy shit. You know, the person that I love, I just saw them yesterday and they're not here. So those things, we're bound to them, and we have to figure out a way. Do we drink ourselves to death? Do we cry ourselves to sleep? What do we do? You know, and it's that suffering, it's that sort of thing that happens.
Were you shading me right now? Like just now?
No, cheers. All right, so, you know, we are forced to reckon. We're forced to reckon with things we don't want, undesirable situations. And I'd say the bravery, in this case, the vulnerability. So bravery and vulnerability, I think, are very, very close. When I teach them in yoga, I teach them is like, when you're meeting the body, the bravest thing that you can do is to meet the most vulnerable places of yourself. And so it's looking at how brave can I be in the face of discomfort and undesirable circumstances? How much can I meet death? And I think, David, you talked about making friends with death, right? So yes. Like, yeah, so just, you know, how much can I meet those circumstances when it's like, oh man, you know? And that even brings us to, like, religion and things like that. Because, like, what are the crutches?
What I brought out in the last 2 versions of this is that it's like a vampire or a zombie or any of these creatures from the underworld that feed on your life force. The cycles that we repeat, I mean, they are like those creatures. The cycles that we repeat in the sense that we are traumatized and we try to validate a perspective that reality, because we're accustomed to it, is always going to be like that. And it's always going to validate that sense of loss, that sense of, it's kind of, we're stuck in a loop, in a toxic loop, trying to repeat and revalidate narratives that are really hurtful to our soul and to our spirit. And Scorpio, having a planet in Scorpio sometimes means that that area of your life was stimulated much in that sense. You had to always prove to someone that you were something. You had to always prove your worth. You always felt like you were a step away from being excluded, from losing, from being harassed or being violented or something like that.
Should we move to Thesis and Chang?
Let me throw up a couple of cards on the screen here. As Elsa has mentioned, the 3 cards for this Decan are Death, representing Scorpio, the Tower, the planetary card for Mars, and then the 5 of Cups. So here I'm going to start with Death because we're going to be seeing this card all through the Scorpio Decans 1, 2, and 3 as the card of Scorpio. So I want to start off actually by reading the Orphic hymn, or a portion of the Orphic hymn to Death. Common to all, you govern some unjustly, swiftly putting an end to life at its youthful peak. But the decision is completed by you alone. You alone are persuaded neither by prayers nor entreaties. I think it's a very poignant and important hymn to death. And we really see that depicted in the far left card here from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is probably the most recognizable card of death that we would see in tarot. And you see this figure, a knight figure that's actually a skeleton. It's a common theme throughout most death cards that we're going to see, especially on this slide, that death is a skeleton. And he's being confronted by a few different figures in this card. There's a king on the ground with his crown having fallen, who we assume has died. There's the Hierophant, or a priest, here in the card with the robes of yellow matching the sun over the horizon. And then there are even children and signs of purity and these children with the flower crowns and the white robes and the blue robes. But they too are in the path of death. They too are facing and need to confront death. So it's a very powerful image here. We have also the black and white contrast really plays into not just the meaning of death, things are going until they aren't. It's very Mars-like, right? Severing. There's a hard cut between life and death, just like there's a hard cut between black and white. There's skulls and crossbones on the harness for the horse that we see, as well as the tobacco leaf, the tobacco flower, that's presented on this flag. All of these things really have to do with this idea of purity through death, that it cleanses in some way. And, this is just such an appropriate card for Scorpio, regardless of how positive or negatively you feel about the death card. Anecdotally, again, another anecdote, a lot of Scorpios that I know and I'm very close to do go through periods of extremes. That black and white, that testing of themselves, of whether they can, if they can fast for 16 hours a day, or if they can completely cut out sugar from their diet, or if they can revel in their addictions for months and months at a time and survive and come out the other side. And that itself is extremely Scorpionic to me.
Now KG's calling me out. Yes, I concur. So, David, I believe that you were talking about, we had a little bit of a conversation about the descent of the sun, or the sun on the descendant here.
Yes, behind the 2 towers that also appear in the moon, and that are also represented by the pillars in the Hierophant card and the High Priestess card, which are the kind of gateways to consciousness in a way.
We see another gateway to consciousness with the High Priest here, and really, what can we do but pray, or what can we do? And I guess if you think about this, is our shamans or our religious leaders or whatever, like part of what we do all of that for is to confront our sicknesses and our deaths and our grieving processes. You know, the priest here is looking straight on, hands up, like what else can I do but like be here to confront death, say the prayers for the king, and console the leftovers, whatever, you know, the other people. So it's like,
and again, bringing that idea of revelation through death and through the endings of things, as the descending sun is, remember, the descendant. If you don't know exactly what that is, we have a video about this, talking about the Mitra George's book here in the channel with Matt, Elsa, and I.
the 7th house, it'd be the 7th and 8th house video.
Yes, and actually the 5th, 6th, and 7th house video.
And then maybe the 8th, if you wanted to talk about being pulled to the descendant or the house of death or something. But yes, the 7th house.
Specifically here talking about the house of the descendant, where through endings and through denying your own ego, through denying your own idea of self and all of that, you learn something. Something is revealed to you about a certain topic or a certain relationship in your life. And here with death, the skeleton is also representative of the things that are the core of us, but also the hard truths, the things that are crystallized within us and our narrative, that when we die become the backbone of who we are for the people who talk about us and who remember our narrative from what they experienced. And so death is the ultimate judge, is the ultimate emissary of fate, you know, and judgment upon humans.
And you know where
the descending sun, the two towers, and the skeleton for me kind of combine in a nice way in that interpretation.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I just wanted to comment on a couple of things that you both said. One, the tobacco flower, which I'll get to, but just what you were saying, David, about we learn who we are when we're confronted with death or hardship, like in a real way. It's like, oh yeah, you know, I said all my prayers. I thought I was like comfortable with death, but this mortality that I'm now facing, I'm ill-equipped to deal or whatever. It's just like those visceral things where it's like, yeah, we've thought about this and practiced this 1,000 times, or like, you know, in tantric paths or in certain yogic paths or whatever, we're really reckoning with our own death. In fact, even practicing, a lot of meditative qualities are practicing for the moment of death, so that when it arrives, we can have some composure and have some bearings when we know that it's going to be confusing and we know that we're going to lose our footing, kind of practicing for those experiences. But we all know that no matter how comfortable we are in those spaces, it really shows us who we are, and we do lose our composure and our footing. Like there's no real good way to do it, and surrender is the word, right? And when you think about like the purity, we're thinking about the children, and you know, we've got this tobacco flower, which is, tobacco is a very grounding and sacred herb used in prayer within a lot of traditions in the Native American communities especially. So it's like, and in the Americas in general, tobacco is used as a very purifying and very sacred herb. So just looking, those are just like two notes that I had. I don't have anything profound to say, but it just kind of like, when we're grieving and when we're praying and we're like, I don't know what to do, Jesus takes a wheel or whatever it is, like God, like, you know, it's like that type of scenario is when we would offer tobacco, and when we sort of come in humility and be like, I don't know what to do, my tools aren't working, this poison is too poisonous, right? So Scorpio is also poison. We see the skull and crossbones, right? It's like things that are poisonous to us. And those things could also be like psychedelics and alcohol and sex and all these things that are like these liminal spaces where we are losing part of ourselves. There is a loss. And we do gain a certain spiritual consciousness through some of these moments. Like if you or someone you love either, you know, gets a diagnosis or a critical injury or dies suddenly, you realize what's important all of a sudden. and everything else dissolves away. Like everything that you thought you were stressed about and all your life and livelihood, it's instantly tiny and pales in comparison, where you're just like, what stress? I just lost a loved one. What stress? Like, I'm disoriented. Like all of a sudden everything comes into focus. You know what I mean? And the importance comes into focus. Like, so I feel that way with like sacred plants like tobacco or poisons or hallucinogens that are associated with the scorpionic archetype, whereas like you have to, the body completely dissolves when, say, you're taking ayahuasca or something, and you have to figure out what you're going to do if you feel like you're dying, or if you don't have a body anymore and your consciousness is severed from your body. So it's like things like that really put into perspective what the hell we're doing and why we're attached to things we're attached to. So yeah, I think I'm done. And I think KD, you had an explanation of this next card, of sort of the stripping away.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, there's one other thing I wanted to say about the one on the left, the Rider-Waite-Smith card, which is you definitely should notice the river, the same river that runs through the beginning of the moon card. But it's also continuing behind the skeleton on the horse, and there is a boat on the river. It's taking a journey. And I think that that is also very relevant to the idea of death, that it's not just necessarily a one-time thing. There's a journey that's coming afterwards, or coming around that transformation, that sacred rite of passage, so to speak.
Yeah, and the ferryman that takes us across the river of death. So we go ahead with this.
Which is exactly what we see in the next card. So actually, it's funny because when I zoomed into this card in the middle, it's the traditional tarot deck, Tarot of Marseille. It is actually the skeleton holding a scythe and cutting down all the worldly goods that one would try to accumulate during life, but do not transcend the border with death. But what it actually looks like, he's doing is rowing. It looks like that's an oar, and he is rowing along a river. And that immediately calls to mind the river Styx, which is in ancient Greek mythology, the river guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And there's the Hades that is on the other side. I think there's something Roman, right? The oarsman that rows people across the ferry. But in any case, all the things.
Yeah, the ferryman Charon.
Yes, that's right. Yes. But at the bottom you see not just things of signs of wealth, but also of knowledge, of privilege, and even to some degree of like the sort of Mars things that we would consider like sport and fun and vigor. All those things are just cut down in the face of death. And that's why I wanted to include that here as another symbol of the skeleton. I think that was beautiful what you said, David, about it being representative of crystallization. I
actually took that from the Pythagorean decks text.
Oh, I have that card next, actually.
They're available online, but I wanted to mention before you move on to that, the river behind, because I think last time we tried to do this, you also mentioned the river being part of the High Priestess card, because all rivers really that show up in the tarot are coming from that initial card, the High Priestess. All rivers, all waters that show up in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot are referring back to that card. And they refer back to the principle of the High Priestess, of being connected to one's deeper understanding of how life works, of how circumstance should go, because you have an innate sense of what's happening around you. You just have to learn how to use it and how to trust it and how to consciously be aware of it. But here, the High Priestess reference of the rivers shows that in death, it is revealed everything that we are, but we are always aware of it. Like, it's always in the back of our minds. It's something that is always in the background of all of our narratives. The High Priestess is this thing of innate knowing. It's like we're always anticipating this particular moment, and that river is leading to the setting sun in the towers, again showing up in the moon card. So it's referencing to me like we are always afraid of death, and we are always aware that it's coming, and we are always trying to avoid it somehow. But in the end, the most revelatory thing of all for a human being is how dignified are they when they're dealing with death? How capable of keeping their spirits or their essence, their identity, when going through those processes. And that will depend a lot of how they dealt with the idea of death in life, or tried to avoid it in the cycles that they repeated.
Yeah, and I think, just explicitly intuition, right? Like you're saying, that feeling that comes from the high priest, priestess, I'm sorry, that knowing. And again, we're talking about the waters. We're talking about
that it's always coming. What we're always afraid of in the relationships and in the situations that we're in that are frightening to us is generally death.
The fears and the idea of the skeleton. I think the reason why we see it in, whether armored in the Rider-Waite or completely stripped here is like, I think the middle card, the Marseille deck, really shows the stripping away, or the skeleton. It's like you strip away the flesh, the blood, the memories, the wealth, the knowledge. Like, it doesn't matter how much you study yoga, die once, see what you remember. So it's just like, so you're dealing with like that primordial sensation when you're dying. Like, I'm hot and cold, I'm confused, I'm stripped of the body, I don't have the knowledge, I can't, it's not, you don't have this firm grasp, right? So you're dealing with this very intuitive space that we see pouring out from the high priestess Go ahead.
One phrase that I really like from the Bible, it is in Corinthians, I think, 1 Corinthians 15, not quite sure. But it was, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And that appears in Harry Potter as well. That's why I was familiar with it.
It's the basic thing of, it's the basic thing if you can't take anything with you, right?
But the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death is deep, not only because death is the ultimate end of every living thing, but because also when you conquer death in your consciousness while living, when you make friends with death, basically, you're capable of anything. And you become capable of really dealing with any circumstance that comes your way. And not repeating cycles, becoming more of who you are through the challenges that life proposes to you, because they are as common to you and as common ground as the good things in life, And
I think if you practice like a tantric Buddhism, or if you practice like a yoga, or you pray to Shiva or Kali or any of these archetypes, right? You get this sort of like juice or nectar of life, like by contemplating death, or by making friends with death, you're really living. You're really allowing yourself this like freedom, this courage, this sort of like essence to the fact that like, it's a liberating force. And I think that's what we're talking about with the Blasted Tower, the Lord of the Hosts of the Mighty, or the Child of the Great Transformers, which is the death card, right? Is like, we're really allowing ourselves, we're really liberating ourselves in a lot of ways if we can get to that point of being grateful for every moment and, all those things. So speaking of Harry Potter, we've got the asphodel flower here pictured in the Pythagorean version of death. And it was said, the flowers were said as being beautiful and bringing comfort to those in mourning, and its roots were said to feed the dead. And I like,
for those of you who didn't catch the reference, it's actually an ingredient in the Draught of Living Dead, which is a sleeping potion.
Yeah, sleeping
mentioned
potion.
In the first book of the series.
Absolutely. And then we've got mint. So for those of you who are using herbal kind of associations, we can definitely bring out the mint in this season. But I like this card for a few reasons. We've got the severing, which is very Martian. We don't have a body or even a skull necessarily here. We've just got parts, body parts. So we're severing ourselves from the body and its parts and the way it
and what it's saying actually is that none of the things that we do with our hands, none of the pathways that we've trailed throughout our lives, that we've chosen to trail because we thought they would bring out who we are the most, are important and in death. None of the ideals with the severed heads there are important in death. The crown and the peasant there, the crowned head and the peasant head there are representing that lowly and highborn individuals have the same fate, and all of them are going to be judged just as, coolly.
Yes, right. And just as like, it doesn't matter if we've got the crown and all of this knowledge, or if we've just got the basic knowledge of what it takes to survive. We're all, created equal in death. And the cornucopia, of course, here, which is, we don't know if it's empty, and it kind of like represents, that possibility of just like emptying the cup, I guess you could say. And, I would really recommend for those of you who, if you want to try to get the book, definitely get the book. Otherwise, online, you can get the images as well as the descriptions in this book. So I'll try to link that below. So go ahead and check out the full description of the death and the tower, because they're absolutely beautiful. And we're not going to be able to do it justice because they're long, sort of intricate descriptions. So go ahead and check the death and the tower card out specifically. If not all of them, just follow along with us online. You'll be able to check out the images in real time, and you'll be able to hear the authors, John Opsopaus, kind of break it down for us. So we've got, the original death card holding a staff, not a scythe or not a, all these things. We've got the original, he talks about it being a staff, but here he puts a flag, kind of representing that, again, that cutting down of Saturn. So what I think is really interesting is the bones and the skeleton and the clad in black and the sort of reaper are all very Saturnine things, Saturn being the lord of death. And we see that kind of trickling out here, even though we don't see Saturn as the lord of this Decan. And what I think is really beautiful are these wells. When I think of Cancer, I think of like the shores of the water, the sea foam where Venus is born from, like something like these cool, nurturing, sort of like easy for commerce waters. And when I think of Scorpio, I think of deep waters and cold waters. And I see the wells.
Water
Yes.
That's still and harbors poison.
Well, which a well definitely could. And also like frozen water, right? It's fixed, it's unmovable, it's cold, it's deep, it's dark. You need lights to explore.
And hospitable to life.
Inhospitable to life. So I think that's really interesting with the wells, with the white trees and the black trees, and this whole mound has a whole explanation. So I'm not going to belabor this anymore, but this deck is really beautiful, and I'm glad that you brought it up so that we could touch on some of the significations.
Oh, it totally is. I like this depiction a lot. It's very interesting, and definitely is a different configuration. A lot of the symbols that we see in other death cards.
You're talking about the Pythagorean, right?
Yeah, but I also want to talk about the one on the right, which is the Mother Peace deck. This is probably I view this card as very Halloween-y because of the orange and the black. It's like very appropriate for this time of year with what look like leaves falling on the ground. There's some fungus on the trunks of the trees that really appears in the area that I live around this time of year. But then we have the common symbol of the skeleton, which appears in most cards related to death. But I thought the snake was a really appropriate and also meaningful contribution to the symbolism in the death card, because the snake is actually one of the animals that is associated with the sign of Scorpio, first of all. So that's really interesting. There's lions, scorpions, and snakes are all associated with the sign of Scorpio. There might be a couple others.
The eagle.
Eagle. I said
Right.
lion. I meant eagle. Eagle, scorpion, and snake are all associated with the sign of Scorpio.
You were thinking about the world card, weren't you?
I was.
I
was
was,
like, ah.
I was too.
Yeah.
Anyway, the snake, and in this card, the snake is shedding its skin, which is yet another kind of, it's a rite of passage for a snake, right? To transform, get rid of the old and make way for the new skin that is going to theoretically be, you can imagine how people in times where there wasn't a scientific explanation or rationale for why the snake was shedding its skin, you could see it as that snake being reborn, that it looked like it was dying when its skin was coming off and it was shedding, and then it's reborn with a vibrant, beautiful coat. You know,
And
that's the
right, and how it like almost transcends death, right? It's like, oh, it should be dead, but it's somehow wiggling out of death, and it got to live again or whatever.
And it's interesting how snakes also represent this kind of knowledge that is acquired through death, because and through like investigating of occult topics, for instance. And we see that very well depicted in the fall of the Garden of the Eden. The men's fall from the Garden of the Eden, because the serpent is the one that attracts Eve, the feminine, right, into being curious enough to break apart from the divine nature, enough so that their consciousness would become something entirely different. So the snake ushers in this new reality to humankind that is kind of detached from nature, you know, consciousness elevating us to another kind of beingness. So the snake is the holder of that threshold of death in these stories. And again, referencing to that sun in the Rider-Waite depiction of the awareness that death brings, the snake being yellow and orange and shedding its skin in that process of death. I think it's also depicted.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, what the snake being depicted in the Garden of Eden is sort of this feminine temptress or this sort of deceitful like nature, whereas earlier pre-Christianity, we look at a snake as the powerful symbol of the occult. And one thing I wanted to awaken here is just the idea of the Kundalini experience. So if you think about like the tower in the Pythagorean deck, which you guys can go reference, they have sort of this phallic yin yang Kundalini Shiva Shakti experience of the tower. And they're talking about, they have the chakras depicted there, and we're looking at like the awakening of a primordial force being brought up to a place of transformation, being brought up into a place of spirit where we can use those primordial natures for something higher. And a lot of times, you know, people will warn you, right? Like if you are on YouTube or, you know, if you're in the world of yoga, they'll be like, careful of a Kundalini awakening because it can make you like it can be a very powerful and destructive sort of force if you don't go slow and know what you're doing and all this stuff. So that again reminds me of like a tower moment, a big breakthrough, a death. And then the snake being, you know, this orange and yellow. I think one of the things that I looked at is this sort of like sepia tone or black and white tone of the card with the birch trees, and then I love the black background, right? It creates a very stark symbolism and image. But again, I just wanted to call to mind, like, if someone dies or if you get a terminal fateful experience, everything else pales in comparison and becomes black and white in the background of this immediacy of the situation. And that's kind of what I see when I see the colors really jumping out. Even in the fall, it's like it's so beautiful because it's dying, and it kind of shows us those last throws and brings to mind what's really important and in the beauty of death. And then the skeleton being in the fetal position, I think kind of talks about the moon or the moon in fall, or that nurturing or that sort of like curling up that we would want to do to be nurtured, like in Cancer or something like this, with the kind of the bodily sensation of like looking for comfort in the moment of death or something like this. And just that
and how another way to look at it too with the fetal position is that it's in a hibernation, which is, you know, it's in some way nourishing and nurturing to the animals that need to go into hibernation, but it is like a little death. Like you're not necessarily aware and awake and around to engage with the natural world. You are in hibernation. And oh, go ahead, sorry.
And the cycles of samsara, right, are continuing. We've talked about that, but the cycles of nature, when winter and fall hit, like we're not as animals guaranteed to make it through the winter.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so
exactly.
you're just, this imminence of death comes cyclically around, even yearly, for the trees, for the snakes, for the animal kingdom.
The last thing I wanted to note about this card and all of these cards that we've covered for death so far is the fact that bones themselves are a very magical materia, and that they are very powerful by themselves, just as they exist. And so, you probably could assume that with death, there are some very culty vibes going on, but really bones themselves are very magical. And so it imbues this card with a lot of deeper meaning, something of beyond metaphysical meaning, which is really significant, I think, to understanding the full scope of the death card.
Yeah, and I knew this was going to be a long video, so excuse me for belaboring, but I just have one more thing that I want to say, which is it brings to mind like just the power and the significance of bones, and just being this sort of like shocking life force. Like if you encounter bones in the woods when you're walking, or there's branches of aesthetic renunciation within certain traditions in India and Tibet and things like this, where the beggar's bowl, like you will be such a renunciate, you'll renounce from life so much that you only take what's given to you. You only eat what's given to you, and you don't have, clothing or luxuries or sleeping quarters or things like this. You're really just living within nature. And some earlier and continued, but definitely taboo, I guess, maybe something like this sect, even now, yogis or monks will actually take their food from a human skull, and their beggar's bowl is a human skull to remind them of their mortality every single time they're taking in their sustenance. So I think that's just something to be noted about like the moon in Scorpio, right? Or it's like, I'll be nourished, but not before I eat it out of the skull of a human being or something like this, right? So
it's very beautiful to me. I don't know why. It's just something
beautiful.
very beautiful.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I say mantra in this, especially in certain times. I say mantra on, and this is a part of the same tradition, but it's a mala made of bone and carved into little skulls, and you're literally saying your repetition.
So Scorpio.
It very much is.
And I wanted to mention before we move on, like the channel Ask a Mortician.
Caitlin Doherty.
For those of you who want to make friends with death, she is amazing. Caitlin, I forgot her last name.
Doherty,
yeah, she's amazing, and she was featured in that Netflix show, The Midnight Gospel, already as death. So you guys should probably watch that episode from The Midnight Gospel.
Oh my God, in The Midnight Gospel, Duncan Trussell, my freaking best homie. Like, I'm just like a huge Duncan Trussell fan. So we'll link, if we can, we'll do Ask a Mortician and Duncan Trussell. So definitely, absolutely, if you have not watched Midnight Gospel by Duncan Trussell, it is on Netflix. You might have to search it out. But if you want to talk about a psychedelic, scorpionic, death-like, liminal space, go ahead, do yourself a favor.
I think it's also on Netflix.
Yeah, Netflix. Yeah, it's on Netflix.
It's things that will help you get acquainted with the idea of death in life.
Absolutely,
I would say.
And there's a lot of Buddhist teachers that animation series was created from his podcast, where he's interviewing, like he studies with a lot of contemporary teachers, Buddhist teachers and yogis, and also he has clips in there with interviews that he did with his mother, and he lost his mother. He also battled cancer, so he's definitely someone who brings some personal experience to this topic. All right, the Tower.
Okay, so the Tower card is one that we have seen before. We've seen it in, let's see, Aries 1, Gemini 2, and Leo 3. because those are also Mars ruled decans. So the Tower is the card of Mars as the planet. And so you'll see that for every Mars ruled decan that we go through, no matter what sign.
Perfect.
Just to reiterate some of the important meanings that I think we've talked about before, but briefly, the Tower is something that happens suddenly. It's something that happens somewhat catastrophically or traumatically. And it's something that you can't necessarily do anything to prevent because it's a force of nature. Somewhat similar to how death is. Like, you cannot outrun death. You cannot outrun a lightning strike or a massive natural disaster of some sort. It's just the things that happen to us. And so that's a very important part of the Tower to understand. Actually, apologize. I want to go back for 1 second and point out something that we didn't say about the death card.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
I know,
Please
right?
do,
We've talked
please
about
do.
it for so long.
Yeah.
And frankly, I didn't bring this up in the other 2 videos, but the number of death is 13. And at least in Western culture, a lot of times the number 13 is associated with a very unlucky number, which I think is mostly meaningless superstition, but I do think it's important to mention that number 13.
I have a little anecdote about the number 13.
Go ahead.
The 13 was the number of Freya, and Freya's day was Friday. So Friday the 13th was a sacred day to the feminine goddess Freya. And the reason why it was and the reason why it was a sacred number to Freya is because there's 13 moon cycles in a year, but only 12 months. That's why we have the blue moon occasionally. So it has to do with like this feminine power of the cycle of the moon and the goddess of nature and abundance and all that. So you can go ahead and, look up Freya and the moons and all of that. But then once we had the sort of like puritanical or Christian kind of like movement, I mean, this is an antidote. I don't know how like exact this is, but it was created as an unlucky day to sort of, as it was a sacred day to the feminine and pagan, and Christianity kind of said this is like a devil's day or an unlucky day, or inauspicious day. It's a woman day and a moon day and a pagan day and all
terrible
these things. So, I don't know, Lord, don't Esoterica channel or someone that really knows, like, please do not strike me down. It's just something that I heard about it. But even if it's an anecdote, it kind of like shows that the number 13 had some auspiciousness with it, but also then like turned poisonous. Yeah. But it was definitely associated with goddess Freya, which is Fridays, and 13 moons in a year and things like that.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, reiterating some of those things about the Tower being catastrophe, I do want to draw attention to this iteration of the Tower, which is from a deck called the Fairy deck, Faerie. And it's the only depiction of the Tower that I've seen that has a mushroom in it, which I feel makes it super related in some interesting way to death and to the process of decomposition, decay, and then the cycle of life. So I think it's a good reminder that the Tower falling doesn't mean death for everyone, that it is sometimes just the beginning of something new going on, but it's also quite a scary image. I don't know.
It is, but you know what? I want to talk about a couple of things that you just said. So, Scorpio and toxins, and toxic medicine and poisons, right? We've got the Amanita muscaria as the mushroom of choice here, and we go ahead. There's a whole deep research you can do with the Amanita muscaria and reindeer and Santa Claus and the kind of like deep tradition that this possibly psychedelic liberation, but yet very toxic, or depending on who you ask, toxic mushroom. So you've got a mushroom that so many people throughout time have said can bring death. Don't mess with it. It's toxic. And then other people who are saying like, no, actually, it's a liberating and potent medicine. So I think that's very apropos for this decan, as well as you can think of the Tower as like one thing. We're trying to protect ourselves and protect our kingdom. And so we build a high tower so that we can look out and have this vantage point and see like when our enemies are coming in order to prepare ourselves and protect ourselves, right? But then that tower also becomes our imprisonment, right? So you can imagine like a Rapunzel moment where you've actually got people captive by the tower and they're being liberated at the moment that they are freed from the tower. And although it's a tragic moment and we might be falling to our deaths, it could be out of our own, kind of like that Tower of Babel moment. Out of our own ignorance, we built the tower too high and now we must fall, kind of that ego moment. Or we've been sort of held captive by something that we've built and built and built, but we don't even really like. And it sort of like strikes it down and allows us to, you know, liberate ourselves from the moment. I just wanted to show briefly the tower card from the Afrogoddess deck, and I'm gonna go ahead and link that below. But it's got the White House and people falling from the White House. So it can be, again, this one just reminds me of the rebel spirit of Mars, of just like overturn it, like let's be done with it already, you know. And a lot of times we see the crown falling and stuff. So a lot of times it's like a people's card of like, you know, fuck the king or whatever, like burn it down, like, you know, that kind of an energy. So you've got a little bit of that in the mushroom and the mycelia. And if you think of like a lot of these people doing work with the mushroom and the mycelia of like cleaning up our environment and our oceans, and how like now they're showing that all mycelia and mushrooms like connect pretty much the entire earth together in this underground, again, underground scorpionic, this huge grid of information. So like if a tree in a forest is dying or sick, it's sending its sugars through this mycelia in order to tell the other trees in the forest that it needs help, and they can send their sugars over, or they can isolate that tree through mycelia so that the whole forest doesn't catch this virus. So it's like, it's very much an underground communication, psychedelic underground communication, something like this. And if you think about underground communication, you also think of like rebellion and the falling of the corrupt systems and things like that. So I see all of that kind of moving through this card, this topic.
Yeah, and something we've kind of danced around, and I'll just like acknowledge it, though it's not something that I think any of us really use in our tarot reading practice, is that this card can also be associated with the planet Uranus. And in modern astrology, I think is often somehow, not in any system that I'm totally aware of, somehow attributed to that planet as a major arcana card. So it has that Uranian theme of rebellion, you know, kind of going against the norm, catastrophe, and trauma. The Five of Cups is the minor arcana card for this Decan. And as Elsa mentioned at the beginning, we have the Lord of Disappointment here is kind of what we're looking at. So the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is on the far left here. You see 3 cups have tipped over and 2 cups are still upright, but there's a river behind him as well, this figure who we could call the Lord of Disappointment. The card really generally means sacrifice, disappointment. Again, we use the key word bereft before because it indicates a significant emotional loss. Bereavement is another way that you could think of it, especially when you see this card, the second one from the right, which is the Scapini deck. And we have the guy on his deathbed surrounded by what could be his sons or family members. And there's a process of bereavement going on as they each deal in their own way with the passing of this individual. Again, that has an inherent tie to death as a card. But the Science deck as well, which is the second from the left, has a very interesting meaning in its depiction of the Five of Cups as wildfire. Because what you see is what could be the aftermath of the tower, the aftermath of the lightning strike and the burning of the countryside when a catastrophic situation happens. But beneath the devastation of these charred trees, of the charcoal on the ash on the ground, is potential. There are 2 saplings, 2 small sprouts coming up in the foreground of this card. And so it's really emphasizing that transformational side, I think, of the death card, which is it's not the end of everything, it's just the end of this thing, and it's going to be different after on. So as with any minor arcana card, you could kind of look at them as happening on a smaller scale, but this really is, it's called the Little Tower. This card really is quite symbolically strong compared to a lot of other minor arcana cards. So again, being the Little Tower, clearly it has some heft. I mentioned this river behind the death card in Rider-Waite-Smith is also the same as the one that we see in the Five of Cups. So it's appearing once again, that through stream of water, which is the element of the Cups cards, definitely reminding us of the fluid, intuitive, almost psychic nature of a lot of the feelings that come up around grief, bereavement, loss. Very poignant in these cards.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure, did you mention about forest fires being a vital element to forests? Have you gone on?
Yeah. So there's some saplings growing in the foreground here. It's absolutely necessary for there to be wildfire to clear out the dead underbrush in order for the forest to ever really thrive. So important
when
part
we're
of the
talking
cycle.
about, it is an important part of the cycle, but when we're talking about like cycles being imbalanced and things we have to deal with, we're looking at like climate crises or like lack of water. So when we're talking about the nourishment of the water and that kind of like river that runs through everything, in my heartfelt condolences to all of those people that have to deal with fires being a real part of their life and a real destructive force in their life. California, Australia, things like this, all the West Coast, really. We have climate crisis because the mycelia is messed up and the fires are messed up and it's too dry. So this thing that's a natural cycle, that there's certain trees that they'll only release their seeds once fire has come through. So it's a very natural part, but it's out of balance, right? So I think when we're dealing with disappointment and things like this, a lot of times we're dealing with things that are out of balance, like 3 cups spilled, 2 cups left, like that kind of a thing. So I just wanted to kind of bring that into focus for a second.
Yet another reason why the Mother Peace deck, which is on the far right, is a super beautiful depiction, I think, of the Five of Cups. It doesn't have the same inherent, you look at it and you feel the loss as a lot of the other cards that I've depicted here do, but it's still super meaningful in that we have 5 cups or urns here that are being covered by starfish. Those are 5 different starfish, and clearly underwater, another water theme there. But the important thing to know is that these starfish, these red starfish, their job is actually to eat or consume the dead coral reefs. And it actually turns that into sand, and it actually turns that into the cycle under the water, even, that rejuvenates, replenishes itself. And just as in the 5 of Cups from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, only a couple of these cups are actually tipped over in the Mother Peace deck. Many are still upright. And while the things tipping out of the cups in the Mother Peace deck initially look to me like bubbles, they're actually supposed to be pearls. They're pearls that are cast down to the depths, beauty that's not meant to be harvested or seen by people above the surface. And there's really something important about that, in my estimation, of grief and how valuable and enlightening and personal that is to each person. Those are the pearls that are being cast down to the depths in this Mother Peace deck. And again, a lot less shocking necessarily on first sight, but very poignant.
Yeah, almost like they've been hoarded and harvested and they're now being given back to sort of tip that balance. And what's interesting about the Mother Peace is there's 2 cups spilled, 3 cups left, which is the opposite, where we usually see 3 cups spilled and 2 cups left, which is, interesting. I just find it interesting. And in the 5 of Cups, Lord of Loss and of Pleasure in the Hermetic deck, the pip, we don't see any cups spilled, actually. We just see the upside down 5-pointed star. So anyways, we're seeing different depictions. And then we've got this Capini deck where we see like everyone kind of having their own relationship to death, like, you know, right? Like one person's like taking the well, one person's like crying and mourning for themselves, the other person's, oh, we have to take care. We've got all this like hustle and bustle. And if you've ever experienced, you know, the dying of a loved one, right? Like everyone's in their busyness, like, oh, you come in here, oh, you got to get home, we got to take care of the person, da da da. But we're doing so many things because we're in grief and da da da. Like there's very few people that are just still and present and dealing with the experience of the person dying.
Absolutely.
Their sensations, their experience. It's very much like, you know, our grief and are they okay? Are they comfortable? Where's the doctor? Is so-and-so coming? Where's the funeral arrangement? And it's like we very much get lost in that kind of like thing. And a lot of times you'll see people where it's a time maybe that we would like to see ourselves come together and our better natures come forward. We a lot of times see fighting over dowry, or not dowry, inheritance, or like sibling rivalries, or like, oh, dad said he wanted this, but I heard him say he wanted this, and like all these kind of like death busyness, or like these kind of like.
I literally just had a tower moment. You know that they call it the 5 stages of grief?
Exactly. That's what we're seeing here.
I think that might be it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that's what we have. We had a little bit of denial over here. Little kid playing around.
And doesn't really care like who's grandpa anyway, old, smelly, like they don't get that, you know, they're on the chopping block or whatever, you know. So the youthful sort of like innocence of the fact that like there's so much time before you that you don't really contemplate or even really understand, you know, what's being spilled.
It's remarkable.
Wow, that's really, yeah, that is a sort of flash. I wanted to talk about that actually, about, you were saying my computer froze during when you were talking about Uranus, but you know, originally Jupiter was lightning, right? And it's like this flash of knowing, right? And so I think that's really interesting because we see Uranus as like sudden or tragic or like unexpected, like shock, right? So I can see it, sure. Okay, cool. That goes to the tower. It's a shocking, unexpected kind of moment. But originally lightning is Jupiter. And we get these sort of like aha moments, right?
Yeah, it's like they're really not mutually exclusive. I really see how the strike of lightning, the strike of enlightenment that Jupiter might bring is so destabilizing and disorienting in some situations. You can't make yourself back. You know, you can't.
Boom! That's that Kundalini. That's exactly right. Like you can't unknow. It's like there's the ignorance is bliss thing, right? And it's like it's the same thing as that Kundalini awakening. It's like, oh shit, well, I kind of wish I didn't know or whatever. You know, there's
never mind. Can I put that back in the box? Nope, not possible.
Right. Exactly.
It's out.
And it reminds me of something. I mean, I know we're on the 5 here, but it reminds me of something that Susan Chang says in her book, which is death shows us what we fear, and the tower shows us why. So I think that's a good like little bit of a conclusion, or you guys, if you guys have anything you want to speak to when it comes to that. But it's like, you know, she talks about give the ferryman his due, for loss is the price that we pay for love. The river of loss and love. Sacrifice is to make something sacred, right? So if we can think about loss in the way of like we willingly give you our life. It's like I surrender to you the soul of my loved one. Part of where we could find comfort or beauty in loss here.
So, as usual, if you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell button, and like this video, as well as commenting your thoughts and engaging with us in any way you can to support this channel and the work we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Yes, like, sub, drop emojis below, and we will continue to dive deep during Scorpio and all the rest of the Decans. So please follow. You can find David at In the First Place here on YouTube and at In the First Place Astrology.com. right? Yes. And then we've got KD Dayton and kddayton.com. And you guys both have astrological works, tarot works, as well as myself. And you can find me in the About section, as well as everybody else in the About section of this page. We're going to have a bunch of stuff listed in the links this time. So go ahead and check out the description below. And we are on our way. Thank you for getting us to 200 subs. I know it's a small number, but to us, we're celebrating it still. And we are going to do a little giveaway or some kind of like a little celebration once we get to 300. So come on, Scorpio season, let's go. All right, KD, would you graciously bring us out with the poem that T. Susan Chang gives us in the back of the book?
Yes, definitely. So the poem at the end of this chapter is called Mythic Fragment by Amy Clampett. When the stern god approached me with his gift, my fear enchanted him, so that he ran more quickly through the wet grass as he insisted to praise me. I saw captivity and praise. I saw the lair. I begged my father in the sea to save me. When the god arrived, I was nowhere. I was in a tree forever. Reader, pity Apollo at the water's edge. I turned from him. I summoned my invisible father as I stiffened in the god's arms of his encompassing love. My father made me no other sign from the water.
Matao kako bersama you demikian soba da soba kena matahiba nakau di mawa demikian soba and soba ataiba nake aujuno ba ikana kamaya da onga esa Your Majesty, Matahibe kana sabaso Indakina, Tabaine, Do your bows, in by your domain, with the bike, Tiona Macano, your sono meia bagogina Gamoyara goyini Onma veigo bai Dio ma macano yo sono meia bagogina